Good day, everyone. I could still remember instances when I got late for the next class, simply because I cannot help but accept the invitation of the books of the Scanlan Library that they be scanned, skimmed, and read. In other words, that they be explored. I find some books understandable, while others not. I suspect that the lack of a bridge between my intellectual horizon and that of the authors of those books that I find difficult is a key reason why I just can't get what they intend to communicate. Texts are like books, but more. Texts reflect the cultural horizons of the people that made them. And so, the degree to which our own cultural horizons meet theirs is also the degree to which we find such texts intelligible. Together, let us explore texts reflecting different cultures. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to show that you understand how important cultural context is to the communication process. 2, that you should also be able to analyze texts reflecting a variety of cultures and practices. And 3, see why cultural identities and differences merit our appreciation. Let's jump right in. For part 1, let's define what text, context, and cultural context are. Further, let's see how important context in general, but also cultural context in particular, is to the communication process. Okay, so what is text? We usually use it to mean the main body of printed or written matter on a page. But that's not how text is technically used in linguistics. It instead has 3 definitions of varied specificity. The first defines text simply as communicated being in general, whether verbal or not. The second excludes nonverbal communication, for it includes only being that is housed in language in Heideggerian terms. It also specifies that the text must be unified semantically, that is, the words must be woven together by one logos or intelligibility or deep structure or meaning, and not just at the level of surface structure, thereby making it coherent and complete, not random. Even narrower than this, the third definition restricts text to what is visible. These definitions seem to differ only at the level of emphasis, and so we'd use all of them in this course. Having defined text, let us now turn to context, which refers to everything that functions as the background in which text is embedded. Context is not just passively received, but could also be actively designed by the communicator. Context conditions our interactions, and the key kind of context is culture. Cultural context encompasses how a group structures itself in how it acts and in how it thinks, thereby conditioning the value and the meaning of the texts that they create. It is distinct but inseparable from what might be called cultural context, for unlike it, culture is highly particularized by a society. Now, miscommunication is a real risk. Hence, we struggle to avoid it by designing our texts to be optimally clear in revealing what they symbolize. Since how we think and how we encode and decode information influence the success of the communication process, the relevance of the context that houses them that cannot be underscored. Sadly, due to the finitude of our attention, we cannot factor the whole context in. Even so, grasping a text without it is hopeless. Among the ways in which a text is contextualized, one is shared knowledge of contextualization conventions, or what we call culture. If we'd attempt to grasp a text without taking cultural context into consideration, we'd inevitably get lost. The importance of cultural context is indubitable because the very success of the communication process hinges on it. But how? What is being encoded and decoded? How and why are contingent on the thinking communicators. The way they abstract intelligibility or meaning is the realm of the first level in which culture conditions the communication process, namely the cognitive level, or at the level of thinking. Now, the second level of cultural contextualization of the communication process is structural. How we think is influenced by how we speak, for we often think through words. A unique worldview is therefore created by a society negotiating a common language habit. What we abstract and what we value are conditioned by our shared speech patterns, thereby forming for each group of communicators a unique worldview. And the third level is called discursive, in which the cultures of, for instance, an academic community or a guild, in which the communication process is situated, condition it. There is indeed a multi-level way that culture conditions the communication process, encompassing how the communicators think and how they encode and decode texts, so an emphasis on cultural context could be justified. But such could be overstated to become a form of radical relativism that detaches thinking from reality itself. But how could two people situated in radically different cultural horizons successfully communicate without a bridge? Without a bridge through which the message could be mediated, miscommunication is inevitable. This extreme cultural relativism, however, is decisively refuted by the presence of authentic, albeit imperfect translations of texts. Culture primarily conditions the kind, not the facticity of what we think. And each culture is like a map. Just as many maps could be made for one place, political, physical, or economic, or what have you, each of which highlighting true aspects of reality, so could there be many different cultures, each of which representing one reality. This one reality could be that bridge between cultures. And universal access to that one reality is grounded in the universality of human nature. Culture unveils itself to minds, and hence, when with some patience, cooperation, and time, by means of this bridge, message could be effectively transmitted even across people with different cultures. Having probed the possibility of intercultural communication, let's analyze how texts themselves are revelatory of the culture in which they're rooted. In 1789, the separation of English into two distinct British and American languages seemed certain. That they are still essentially one today is revealing of the continued constant interaction of the two main cultures that speak it. Studying convergences and differences in each flavor of English reveals the historical and cultural conditions that produce them. Amidst the wealth of similarity, there are at least 5 ways in which they now vary, in terms of spelling, pronunciation, vocabulary, idioms, and register. Spelling-wise, the American English uses an S for the word defense, while the British English uses a C for the same term. For the latter, the word color has a letter U, while for the former, it does not. Pronunciation-wise, British English puts the stress in some words on the first syllable, like adult and vaccine, while American English puts it in the second, like adult and vaccine. Philippine English also has its idiosyncratic way with pronouncing words. In it, elementary becomes elementary. Okay? Notice, science becomes science. Catholic becomes Catholic. Zero becomes zero. And so on. Notice also that Americans blend syllables wherein got you becomes gotcha and thank you all becomes thank y'all. Vocabulary-wise, What we call comfort room is called restroom in American and toilet in British. Such names make it seem like the phenomenological dimension of toilet, that in it we find rest and comfort, became ingrained into our very concept of it so much, such that it cannot but be essential to how we name it. Idiom-wise, when one is exerting much effort for an unfruitful project, the British would say that one is flogging a dead horse, whereas the Americans would say that one is beating a dead horse. When one is scrupulous with the details but cannot see the whole picture, Brits would say that one can't see the wood for the trees, while the Americans would say that one can't see the forest for the trees. Register-wise, English translations of texts vary in formality. Such variety, again, reveals a lot about its intended reader. If translations are so formal, then the intended readers are scholars. Otherwise, the intended readers are the public. If the register is a Thomistic metaphysics class, the way English is used is way different from ordinary language. For instance, one can ordinarily say, "You ate my ice cream, didn't you? Don't tell me it ate itself." While the same person, but in such class, could speak about the same idea as potency does not raise itself to act. It must be raised to act with something that is in act. Showing that the way the text is structured indeed reflects the register it's embedded in. A priest I know, who was born in and grew up in the US, told me about how shocked he was when he came to the Philippines and met Filipinos who insisted to him that viand is an English word. He said he didn't know that such word exists in the English language. That reflects their culture, particularly the way they eat. The notion of viand seems to be dependent on having rice as a staple food. Viands are viands of rice, but rice isn't a staple food in the US. Hence, the concept of viand that is so familiar to Asians is quite difficult to grasp by Americans. Even gestures are culturally revelatory. If a person makes a ring with his thumb and his finger while speaking about money, you know he's Japanese. But if a person makes the same ring but expresses some insult, you know that he's Brazilian. Now that we have learned varieties in the use of language and gestures in texts, revelatory of the various historical and cultural contexts whence they arise, let's ask the fundamental question: why bother? What's so relevant about various cultural identities and differences that merits our appreciation? The question is made more urgent today because our appreciation for culture has waned thanks to our constant cross-cultural interchanges. Why is that a problem? Well, without it, we'd be drowned in disputes and chaos. Carl Jung rightly identified culture as our shield against that chaos. Now, the way chaos haunts other cultures could happen to us. We would either learn from their cultures or the chaos would drown us. But what we don't appreciate, we forget. Hence, we must appreciate these cultures. Another motive for such appreciation lies in the intrinsic value of knowing our stories. For at least two reasons then, cultural identities and differences merit our appreciation. We must defend ourselves from chaos. And the only way to do that is if we first appreciate the various cultures, those of others and those of our own. In conclusion, let me emphasize the following 3 points. 1. The communication process would be inefficient, worst result to miscommunication if factoring cultural context in is neglected. 2. Texts reflect varied cultures in at least the following aspects: spelling, pronunciation, vocabulary, idioms, register, and gestures. And 3. Cultural identities and differences tell us our story and shield us from chaos, thereby meriting our appreciation. And suppose a new exchange student from UK is in your class. When asked to check their classmates' papers, a Filipino student puts X marks in so many of the words written by the exchange student. Both of the students insist that they're right, and they, in different senses, are. As a future teacher, what would you do? And as future social studies teachers, what do you think were the historical circumstances that led to the differences in the way the Filipino kid and the British kid spell certain words? Okay, here are certain references. And that would be all. Thank you.